The world did not expect this. In Ouagadougou, a single announcement shook Washington and echoed across the African continent. I have ordered the Central Intelligence Agency to leave Burkina Faso. Those words spoken by Captain Ibrahim Traoré pierced through decades of quiet submission and foreign control. For many years, under the polished banner of security cooperation, a hidden base had operated on Burkinabe soil. Its mission, they claimed, was to protect the region from terror. Yet its purpose was far more complex. It listened, it watched, it mapped. It traced the gold veins beneath the earth, the uranium fields hidden in the Sahel, and the conversations of those who dared to question power. All the while, billions of American dollars were spent in the name of defense, while nearby villages still struggled for light, for schools, for clean water. The contrast was unbearable, and so, when Traoré spoke those words, the world held its breath. It was not merely an act of defiance, but a redefinition of what sovereignty means in the modern age. To expel a superpower's intelligence service without a single shot fired, was it courage or madness? This is not just the story of one soldier or one nation. It is the story of a continent standing between fear and freedom. And the question that lingers, is this Africa's awakening or the beginning of its greatest test? Burkina Faso did not arrive at this moment by accident. It was a nation shaped by firefare and forgotten promises. For decades, the landlocked heart of West Africa carried a burden that was not its own. It became a stage for other powers to perform their ambitions, a silent arena where the names of empires changed but the control remained the same. France once commanded the military footprint, Europe dictated trade, and the United States arrived later through the quiet shadow of intelligence cooperation. Yet for ordinary Burkinabe citizens, these alliances brought little more than flags and fences. In the dusty streets of Kaya, in the markets of Fedangurma, in the gold fields of Hondo, people spoke the same lament. Foreign aid arrived in millions. Yet the wells were still dry, the schools still dark, and the villages still unprotected. The contrast was not just visible, it was unbearable. Ibrahim Traoré was not born into privilege. He came from Kera, a small village where survival was learned, not inherited. He studied geology before joining the army, a soldier who once marched in the red dust of the Sahel under orders from those who now stand accused of betrayal. By the year 2022, he had witnessed too many funerals of comrades, too many promises broken by the same powers who spoke of stability. That year, as the nation trembled under the weight of jihadist attacks, as thousands fled burning towns, Traoré rose from the ranks and seized control, declaring that Burkina Faso would no longer serve foreign interests disguised as friendship. He was 34 years old. His words that day, "We will reclaim what was lost," echoed far beyond the barracks. The situation he inherited was dire. Burkina Faso had become the epicenter of the Sahel conflict, facing the highest rate of terrorist attacks on the planet. The Barcelogo massacre in 2024, where more than 600 civilians were slaughtered by jihadist groups, revealed the unbearable truth. Foreign powers had poured billions into the so-called war on terror, yet the war kept spreading. The Mansilla attack, the Tawari assault, the bloodshed in the Apaga, all carved deep scars into the nation's soil. The people no longer believed that security came from abroad. They wanted protection born from within. And still foreign advisors insisted that Burkina Faso must maintain strategic partnerships with the same forces whose presence seemed to invite instability. Traoré saw the contradiction. He saw convoys of armored trucks built with American aid rolling past schools without roofs. He saw satellite towers rise faster than hospitals. He saw the faces of the widows waiting for answers that never came. It was in this atmosphere of despair that whispers began to spread, rumors of a fenced compound near Ouagadougou where foreign technicians operated without oversight. Villagers said drones flew at night, the strange antennas turned toward the horizon, and that even soldiers were denied entry. When the young captain heard these whispers, he did not dismiss them. He sent men to observe quietly, without alerting the foreign liaison officers who worked inside the Ministry of Defense. What they discovered changed everything. Trucks bearing no military insignia entered at midnight and left before dawn. Boxes marked with foreign codes were unloaded under armed escort. Local guards were replaced by foreign personnel who spoke neither French nor Malay. Officially, it was a joint intelligence facility. In reality, it looked like something else entirely, a fortress within a sovereign state. The realization struck Traoré like a storm. Sovereignty in Africa was not taken by force. It was surrendered in silence. The true chains were invisible, written in agreements, hidden in signatures, masked by the language of cooperation. And so, the young soldier, who once studied geology, now found himself studying the layers of deception buried beneath his own land. The more he looked, the more the picture became clear. Aid was a pipeline not of hope, but of control. Contracts signed in Paris, Washington, and Brussels dictated the rhythm of national life, while the people of Burkina Faso paid the price in poverty and fear. Yet history has shown that silence never protects the weak. Thomas Sankara had said it 40 years before: "He who feeds you controls you." Ibrahim Traoré understood that truth in the marrow of his bones. And in the year 2025, as he looked upon the compound that stood like a wound on his nation's soil, he made a decision that would echo across generations. If freedom was to mean anything, it must begin by reclaiming the right to decide who watches over the land and who does not. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré ordered a formal investigation into the mysterious compound outside Ouagadougou, even his closest advisors warned him to tread carefully. They knew what it meant to question a superpower's presence. Yet the young soldier did not flinch. One morning before sunrise, a small convoy of military trucks rolled through the capital. The streets were silent, the air heavy. Soldiers surrounded the compound, while a team of engineers and intelligence officers prepared to enter. What they found behind those steel gates would strip away the illusion of partnership that had cloaked foreign influence for years. Inside the buildings, the investigators uncovered the labyrinth of technology, rows of computers, still humming satellite receivers, aimed toward the SIL and servers storing encrypted data. In one chamber, dozens of surveillance drones rested on racks, their wings marked with foreign codes. Another room held maps of Burkina Faso's mineral wealth, gold veins, manganese fields, and uranium zones, all precisely charted with digital coordinates. These were not maps for defense, they were maps for extraction. But the shock ran deeper still. Files discovered on hard drives contained names of Burkinabe citizens labeled as individuals of concern. Among them were teachers, journalists, activists, and even members of parliament, none accused of crimes, only of speaking too freely about national sovereignty. Each file bore the same header subject, linked to anti-Western sentiment. The discovery turned suspicion into outrage. For years, Washington had presented its presence in the Sahel as a shield against terror. Yet the data told another story, a network that listened not only to enemies, but to allies, that recorded the private voices of those it claimed to protect. When the technical officers decrypted the communication logs, the evidence became undeniable. The compound was directly connected to a regional surveillance grid capable of intercepting tens of thousands of phone calls across Mali, Niger, and Chad each day. The reach of this system extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. What had been called cooperation now stood exposed as quiet domination. It was a digital empire built on African soil, invisible but absolute. The reports were brought to Traoré's office within hours. He read every line, his hands steady, but his voice tightening. For a moment the room fell silent. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself. They said they came to protect us. But who protects us from them? The generals around him exchanged uncertain glances. They knew that confronting such power could bring sanctions, isolation, even the threat of overthrow. But the young captain had already made his choice. In his mind, the line between caution and cowardice had vanished. That evening, he stood before the Council of Ministers and laid out the evidence. Photographs of servers, intercepted memos, and satellite diagrams were projected on the wall. Some in the room whispered disbelief, others stared in silence. At the end of his presentation, Traoré said simply, "If we remain silent, we are complicit." He ordered preparations for a public announcement despite warnings from foreign embassies. The decision was irreversible. This was not merely about one base, it was about dignity itself. For decades, sovereignty in Africa had been treated as negotiable, something to be shared or traded in exchange for funding. Traoré intended to change that. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, he drafted the words that would soon circle the globe, a declaration that no foreign power, however mighty, had the right to operate in secrecy on Burkinabe soil. Those around him sensed the magnitude of what was coming. Some feared the consequences, others felt a surge of pride. History, after all, does not ask permission. It waits for those willing to act. And on that night, a young captain in a red beret prepared to challenge the most powerful intelligence agency on earth, not with weapons, but with truth. The following morning, Ouagadougou awoke to a silence unlike any before. Crowds began gathering in the central square, uncertain, yet drawn by a sense that history was about to unfold. At precisely 10 o'clock, Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared before the nation. He wore his red beret and a plain olive uniform, the same one he had worn in battle. In his hands were the documents and photographs recovered from the compound. His face was calm, his voice deliberate. This, he began holding up the files for all to see, is not a security base. It is a control center. It does not protect Burkina Faso. It monitors and manipulates it. The words hung in the air like thunder. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a murmur rippled through the crowd, growing into a wave of shouts and chants. The images projected on a large screen behind him left no room for doubt. The satellite receivers, the surveillance maps, the foreign insignia on equipment labeled as cooperative assets. The truth had been hidden in plain sight, and now it was undeniable. Traoré continued, his tone unwavering. We cannot build sovereignty on secrecy. We cannot defend freedom while living under surveillance. Therefore, I have given the Central Intelligence Agency 48 hours to leave Burkinabe soil. The announcement struck like lightning. News agencies scrambled to verify the claim. Within minutes, Washington received the report. The State Department called it deeply concerning. A spokesperson warned that this decision could jeopardize critical partnerships and humanitarian aid. The threat was clear: without American assistance, Burkina Faso might collapse. But Traoré's reply came swiftly, carried by state radio, and echoed across the Sahel: aid that comes with chains is not aid. It is ransom. Those words spread like wildfire across Africa. In Bamako, students painted them on walls. In Niamey, protesters chanted them through megaphones. Even in Accra and Nairobi, editorial columns described the moment as the roar of a new Africa. European networks called it reckless, a dangerous gamble. American analysts debated whether the young leader understood the consequences. But inside Burkina Faso, people spoke differently. They called him the lion of the Sahel, the man who dared to do what others only dreamed of. Yet beneath the applause lay a storm of uncertainty. To defy a superpower was to invite retaliation, economic pressure, political isolation, even covert destabilization. Traoré knew this. He had studied the fate of Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and other leaders who had once challenged the same system. Still, he did not retreat. That evening, as thunder rolled over the capital, he stood on the balcony of the presidential palace and looked across the city lights. We may lose comfort, he told his aides quietly, but we will not lose dignity. It was not bravado, it was conviction. The following day, the countdown began. 48 hours for the Central Intelligence Agency to pack its files, close its gates, and leave. 48 hours that would test not just one leader, but the will of an entire nation to choose freedom over fear. When the 48 hours expired, Ouagadougou did not explode in chaos, as some had predicted. There were no gunshots, no fire, no confrontation. Instead, there was an eerie calm, as if the city itself was holding its breath. On the morning of the withdrawal, convoys of black sport utility vehicles rolled quietly through the capital, their windows tinted, their license plates removed. Helicopters hovered above the compound, carrying away crates stamped with codes known only to the agency. Computer servers dismantled communication towers, sealed boxes of documents, all were loaded with the precision of a retreat long planned. For the first time in the history of Africa, a Central Intelligence Agency installation was being dismantled in daylight under the watch of the people it once monitored. Journalists from across the continent gathered along the roadsides, their cameras recording a moment few had ever imagined possible. There were no statements from Washington, no visible defiance. The withdrawal was silent, but its silence was louder than any war. As the last convoy disappeared into the horizon, the gates of the compound swung open. The fences that had long stood as symbols of untouchable authority now framed only emptiness. The Burkinabe soldiers entered their boots, echoing on concrete that had once been forbidden ground. Inside, the room smelled of dust and electricity. Monitors still flickered with unfinished transmissions, maps still glowed under dim lights. One engineer described it simply: "It feels like walking inside a ghost." The investigators began cataloging what was left behind, and what they discovered shook the continent once more. Inside a locked chamber, they found racks of data drives humming faintly, a library of information too vast to comprehend. Technical experts confirmed that the drives contained years of intercepted communication, not only from Burkina Faso but from Mali, Niger, Chad, and even Senegal. There were logs of phone calls, emails, and encrypted messages, tens of thousands of them, each tagged with timestamps and coordinates. Alongside these were high-resolution geological maps of the Sahel, detailing gold, manganese, and uranium deposits valued in the billions of dollars. The data proved what many had long suspected, that intelligence gathering was not just about security, but about economics, about mapping the continent's veins before its people could claim them. Among the files were dossiers marked with the names of Burkinabe citizens. Teachers, journalists, and activists who had spoken about independence and dignity were listed as monitoring subjects. One file even referenced a speech by Thomas Sankara from 1984 describing his anti-imperialist message as resonant with current threats. It was as if history itself had been under surveillance. The revelation spread quickly. Within days, news outlets across Africa ran the headline "The Hidden Archive of the CIA in Burkina Faso." In Bamako, demonstrators demanded audits of every foreign base. In Niamey, lawmakers proposed a review of security contracts. In the car, young people marched with signs reading, "If they spied on Burkina, they spied on us all." Even the African Union, so often cautious in its statements, called for an investigation into unauthorized intelligence operations on sovereign soil. Western networks attempted to downplay the discovery, labeling it an exaggeration or routine counter-terrorism data, but the photographs, the coordinates, and the scale of the archives made denial impossible. The illusion of partnership had crumbled. On the ground, ordinary Burkinabe citizens gathered outside the abandoned gates. They sang, they wept, they raised their flag above the compound that had once been sealed to them. For the first time in generations, sovereignty felt visible, not as a word in a speech, but as something real, something earned. As night fell, the lights of the compound flickered out one by one. The city below remained awake, alive with murmurs of disbelief and pride. History, it seemed, had shifted quietly without the sound of war. The fortress of the secrets had become an empty shell, and in that emptiness a nation rediscovered itself. The days following the withdrawal brought both triumph and trial. In Washington, the reaction was swift. Official statements spoke of serious concern and the need to reassess relations. Within a week, the United States suspended all security and development assistance to Burkina Faso. Educational exchanges were frozen, medical shipments delayed, and contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars abruptly cancelled. For a nation with a gross domestic product barely exceeding $20 billion and an annual budget of less than $5 billion, the loss was a heavy blow. Yet in Ouagadougou, the response was not despair, it was defiance. Captain Ibrahim Traoré addressed the nation once more. If sovereignty were for sale, he said, we would be rich already. But our dignity is not for sale. The words struck deep. Across the markets and farmlands, people began collecting donations for local schools and hospitals. University students volunteered to teach in rural areas. Diaspora communities in Europe and North America sent remittances not as charity, but as investment. From Ghana came a pledge of technical assistance. Nigeria offered agricultural support. The African Development Bank announced an emergency stabilization fund for the Sahel. What had begun as punishment was turning into solidarity. Foreign analysts warned that sanctions would starve the nation. But the opposite began to take shape, a slow, painful independence built not on dollars, but on determination. Of course, the costs were real. Inflation rose, imports stalled, and some infrastructure projects halted. Political rivals accused Traoré of recklessness. Rumors of foreign-backed plots circulated in whispers, echoing the fates of African leaders who had once dared to challenge global powers. Yet the young captain stood firm. "Help that comes with conditions is not friendship," he repeated. "It is control." These words, once defiant, had become doctrine. And among the ordinary Burkinabe, something profound was changing. Pride began to replace fear. Teachers hung the national flag in classrooms. Farmers spoke of pooling resources. Small traders carried signs that read, "We stand for our land." The nation had entered uncharted territory, poorer perhaps, but freer. For the first time in a generation, sovereignty was not a line in a constitution. It was a lived experience, a choice reaffirmed every day by those willing to bear its cost. Months after the departure of the Central Intelligence Agency, the once forbidden compound stood silent under the Sahel sun. Its walls, once crowned with antennas and surveillance towers, had become hollow frames of rust and memory. Captain Ibrahim Traoré visited the site alone one morning, walking through corridors littered with abandoned cables and broken screens. The silence was profound. Yet within it, he heard something powerful, the sound of reclamation. He ordered that the compound be transformed, not demolished. "Let these walls bear witness," he said. "What was built here to control shall now be rebuilt to educate." Within weeks, work began. Engineers arrived not to install listening devices, but to lay the foundation for classrooms. Soldiers and volunteers joined hands, repainting the walls and clearing debris. By decree, the site was renamed the Center for African Youth Leadership and Sovereignty Studies. One section would serve as a museum, preserving the confiscated servers, the surveillance maps, and the foreign insignia found inside. Visitors would walk through exhibits that told the story of how a small nation faced the might of a superpower and reclaimed its right to stand alone. Above the entrance, carved in stone, would be the words that had defined Traoré's stand aid: "That comes with chains is not aid. It is ransom." The cost of reconstruction was estimated at $30 million, a fraction of the $500 million once invested in the intelligence infrastructure that had occupied the same land. But the symbolic value was immeasurable. School children would learn history not from distant textbooks, but from the very place where it had been written. Scholars from across the continent began to arrive, eager to study this turning point in Africa's modern narrative. Even critics who had once dismissed Traoré as reckless now acknowledged the power of the transformation. Western journalists described it as a monument to audacity. African thinkers called it the Sankara Continuum, a continuation of the dream that freedom must be built, not begged for. As the project neared completion, a ceremony was held at sunset. Thousands gathered, their voices rising in songs of pride and unity. Traoré stood before them and said, "We do not erase the scars of our past. We turn them into lessons for our future." His words echoed through the courtyard, carried by the warm evening wind. In that moment, Burkina Faso no longer stood as a symbol of resistance alone, it stood as a blueprint for rebirth. What had once been a fortress of foreign surveillance was now a sanctuary of African aspiration. The same rooms that once whispered of control now resonated with the laughter of students, the rhythm of debate, and the promise of a new generation unafraid to question the world. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, the flag of Burkina Faso caught the last light of day, its red and green glowing like fire and hope intertwined. Across the continent, observers asked a single question that no longer sounded impossible. If one nation could transform its chains into symbols of strength, what might happen when all of Africa learns to do the same? The expulsion of the Central Intelligence Agency from Burkina Faso was more than a political act. It was a moment when power shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet irreversibly. A small landlocked nation with a fragile economy and endless challenges had done what many believed impossible. It had said no to an empire. No missiles were fired, no soldiers fell. Yet the tremor reached every corner of the world. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of self-definition. Sovereignty was no longer a ceremonial word spoken at international summits. It was a daily reality measured in sacrifice, courage, and unity. What the world witnessed was not defiance for its own sake, but dignity reclaimed through discipline. A nation once dismissed as dependent had proven that strength is not born from wealth or weaponry, but from the will to protect one's own truth. Ibrahim Traoré had reminded his people, and perhaps the entire continent, that freedom cannot be outsourced, it must be lived, defended, and taught. Across Africa, his words echoed in parliaments, classrooms, and marketplaces. We were not born to be managed. We were born to decide. Whether this marks Africa's awakening or the beginning of its greatest test remains to be seen. But the meaning of the moment is clear. The myth of invincibility has fallen, and in its place rises a new question: what will we build with the freedom we have finally claimed? If you believe sovereignty begins with truth, type freedom in the comments. If you believe courage is the foundation of justice, type Africa Rising. And if you believe the story of the dignity should never fade, share this message. Because history does not change itself. People do. And today, one small nation reminded the world that even silence can roar.